called to the spiritual adventure of a life with God in time through history, knowing our history. God knows the exact tick-tock of your heartbeat. And God is redeeming and saving and transforming the you with your particular story and experiences and historical past. Only you, with your strata of experience in the world, can be what God wants you to be. God's grace is not a reset button. It's not getting a new character in the video game. Grace is not a reset button because God isn't out to erase your history. God is redeeming your history. God is regathering your history. God's grace is not a reset. It is, of course, a resurrection. But we know from Jesus that in the resurrection, we still bear the scars. It is new creation in which you can still recognize the wounds, but everything has changed. Now, the only part I didn't like about Guy's plan is where he said I had 25 minutes. But that's okay. I'll go with it. So I want to say one little parenthetically, I want to say, in the book, How to Inhabit Time, I am trying to help Christians think about this on two different registers. On the one hand, everything that we're talking about tonight, and this is kind of what I'm going to focus on, is about our sort of personal spiritual adventure with God. It's like, what does this mean for me? But I also think it has significant collective and communal and social implications as well for Christians to grapple with. If we don't lean into that quite as much tonight, I would be very, very happy to talk about it in the Q&A time. So I'm just giving you the teaser. Instead, what I want to do tonight is, because the Art House community has been sort of thinking through this theme of patience, which I agree is such an important and timely thing to work on, I wanted to zoom in on just one thread of the book that I think gears into that concern about patience. It's a facet of what I call spiritual timekeeping, in which, and this is what I want to explore with you tonight, why seasons are essential to the Christian life. Why seasonality is an essential feature of the spiritual life. And perhaps most importantly, why God is not surprised by such seasons in our relationship with Him. Indeed, I want to suggest that this is part of God's attention to and sympathy with our temporality. So, as a way into this, I want to try to bring you to the upper room discourse. And in those final moments with the disciples, at one point, Jesus says, and you've heard this before, but I want you to hear it again as if for the first time. He says to them, I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. It's that now that fascinates me. Here is the incarnate God, and He's using a very, very important temporal marker. I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. So when Jesus speaks to His disciples, He sees them, He sees us, as the temporal creatures that we are. You inhabit time, Jesus says. I get it. And at this moment, in this now, there is only so much you can take. There is only so much that you can bear. So God not only recognizes our temporality, I first of all want us to note that His response to our temporality is compassionate. I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. God will not overwhelm our now, our capacity in the moment. there are things we have to go through in order to be able to receive new gifts from God in the future. There are things we have to go through before we even have the capacity to receive the good gifts that God wants to give to us. Our temporality, then, is not some regrettable limitation. It's rather, and by the way, one of the reasons why I think this, I know this is going to make it longer than 25 minutes, but I do think that this is one of the places where Christianity's patience as a cardinal virtue is so deeply countercultural again right now, because I think there is something deeply countercultural about saying, I know something takes time, and that time and temporality are not a limitation in an instant culture, in a culture which expects the quick fix and solution. So to embrace a creaturely spirituality, we don't recognize our temporality, or we don't regret it as a limitation. It is an incubator of possibility. That's why time is the adventure. It is the incubator of possibilities. It might seem, I know this is going to sound very banal and obvious to say it, but spiritual growth takes time. Why? Because we actually need to become different people in order to bear what God wants to show us, what God wants to do in us and through us. I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. In fact, this need for time, the gift of temporality, is mirrored in the very act of creation itself. So when God calls the cosmos into existence, he also starts the clock, right? So it is with the very act of creation that temporality starts ticking. And it's with creation then that time gets created. But when God pronounces over that creation that he calls into existence, he says, it is very good, it's not done. It's not finished. It's not complete. Don't freak out. This is not heresy. I checked it out. When God says of the very good of creation that he has called into existence, that it is very good and it is incomplete. It is awaiting fullness, possibility. The good creation is not perfect. Again, check it out. We can talk about it. It is incomplete. In fact, we know that the garden is destined to become a city. Have you read the book of Revelation? But that is only possible with the unfurling and unfolding of creation's possibilities over time. So this incomplete goodness of creation is really God's sanctification of time and history. The good creation needs a future for us to unfold all of its possibility. It's why I do love that this is the notion of that very good creation as a pregnancy, right? Latent with possibility that needs time to gestate, to give rise, to give birth to what is to come. Now, interestingly, are you all still okay with me? Everybody love? Okay. If we come back to John's gospel, you can also see the entire Trinity at work in this and is involved in our temporal growth. So God's temporal sensitivity, I'm going to call it, is revealed in the Son, who says, I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them yet. And then what does he immediately say afterwards? When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth, right? So I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. When, another temporal word, indicator word, when the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. Now, if you think that promise was fulfilled at Pentecost, I have a conversation for you. Because it is clear, it is certainly not the case that the church was granted access to all truth at Pentecost. Right? It's not like, oh, all the hard work of trying to figure stuff out ends in Acts 3. Have you read Acts 10? Have you read Acts 15? Have you read, right? All kinds of discernment still is undertaken when the Spirit arrives. It's not that the Spirit's arrival ends the need for discernment, it makes it possible. And so now we start doing this work. The Spirit's promise to guide us is as long as history itself. That, my friends, is what we mean by Catholicity. Catholicity is believing Jesus' promise that the Spirit always guides us across the course of history. I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. The spiritual significance of temporality is that we have to go through, undergo, in order to be able to receive more from God. We cannot bear it all now. So whatever moment you find yourself in, there is truth and grace yet to come that you cannot bear now. There is something that you have to endure, something that you need to go through in order to get to a place where the Spirit can show you that something new, can do that something new in you. Look, if you invite a philosopher, if you give a moose a muffin, if you invite a philosopher to give a talk, I want to do one little thing about philosophy. You don't have to have heard of this philosopher. His name was Georg Hegel. 19th century German philosopher. He has this amazing line that I absolutely love because it's a metaphor. This is in a book called Elements of the Philosophy of Right. It's at the end of his preface. He says, it sounds like a password in a James Bond movie. The owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. The owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. All right, we'll let you in. Now, so try to picture it. The owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. I want to hang with this because I think there's a deep spiritual principle that he's tapping into here. Okay, Minerva. What is Minerva? Minerva was the Roman name for the goddess of wisdom. Okay? By the way, we're not pro-paganism. This is the historical context. So Minerva, wisdom. The owl was her sacred bird. And we still get that. Do you know, like sometimes you watch like Schoolhouse Rock and the wisdom, wise people are associated with, you see owl and he's wearing a graduation cap, things like that. Okay. So owls, wisdom, and Hegel says the owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. What's he talking about? Hegel's point is that it takes time to achieve wisdom. By the way, if you're like 75, this is not a shock. If you're 25, it is an affront to your intelligence. To say that the owl of Minerva only flies at dusk is to say sometimes enlightenment only arrives at the end of the day. That understanding, that illumination, that insight was not available in the morning. You had to make it through the day. The owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. And in the same way, I think we could say that the dove of the Spirit's illumination will sometimes take flight only after we have endured a season. We have got through a day. We have made it through a time. And so I want to highlight a few features of what I think constitutes the seasonality of a spiritual life and think through some of the implications of that. Think of it as this is seasonality, and I don't mean fall, winter, spring, and summer. I mean chunks of a life that we experience. across the course of a lifetime. Think of it as seasonality as a spiritual condition. The first thing I would say is seasons of a life are focal. They are focusing. They sort of, well, I have great notes. Let me just say it this way. There are times in our lives, both individually and collectively, by the way, that will be given over to what a season requires us to focus on. In this sense, a season is focal because it requires something of us. And if we give it time, if we give over our time to the experience, if we allow it the time it needs to unfold, it turns out you will also get something back. So we carry something out of that experience, right? If you're in a season that is focal and is asking something of you, in a way, it's asking. You're giving yourself over. You might experience it as taking. But if you can get to the end of the day when the owl flies, it turns out you get something back. And it'd be interesting for folks to think through, like, how have you experienced this seasonality in your life? I mean, I think I keep looking at Guy because I'm just thinking of the intense experience they're undergoing right now. But I'll say, like, when we were young and child rearing, now we're empty nesters and waiting for grandkids. But when we were young and child rearing, in some ways I feel like if somebody had told me this is a season and it's not forever, I would have appreciated when I was in my life differently. First of all, I would have thought, thank God this isn't forever. But I also would have thought, I need to enjoy this while I can and how I can, because of the ephemerality of that experience. So you can imagine all kinds of different seasons that you experience in life. Letting the season take the time it demands can sometimes be grueling and doesn't immediately translate into rejuvenation. Sometimes what's required is for us to pass through a season of reckoning, for example, including reckoning with our own sins and our collective sins and failures. To give ourselves over to such a season, to focus on what that season demands, means don't rush to resolve or escape it. Don't rush to resolve it or escape it, because we might be short-circuiting exactly what is going to be the gift of that hard, arduous work of reckoning. For everything, there is a season. Ecclesiastes tells us. It's still wild to me that basically somebody sang Ecclesiastes in the 60s and it was a #1 hit. Do you know what I mean? To everything, turn. It's really just totally a ripoff of the King James Bible. For everything there is a season, the teacher tells us in Ecclesiastes. But can I say that it does feel like the teacher of Ecclesiastes seems to leave out something kind of crucial. While he rightly counsels us to recognize both individually and collectively that our lives will be lived in seasons, a time to plant, a time to pluck up, a time to build, a time to tear down, a time to give birth, a time to die. Great, get it, important. What he doesn't tell us is how to know what time it is. How do we recognize our season, whether collectively or individual? How do we know when it's time to plant or the season to pluck up? How does a season come into focus? And how does our responsibility and calling in that season come into focus? Can we know in the midst of it? Pretty important. Well, this is the second feature then of seasonality requires discernment. Seasonality requires the hard work of discernment. One of the core disciplines of what I call spiritual timekeeping in the book is discernment. And think of discernment as really an effort at orientation in time. I suggest that when are we is one of the most fundamental questions that we can be asking, both individually and collectively. And one of the most significant exercises of discernment we can undertake across our lives is to try to grasp our seasonal location. Now, the challenge, of course, is, and you all know this, you've experienced it, what's frustrating is sometimes I don't know that it was a season until I'm right at the very end of it. And then you look back, you're like, oh, and you're already sort of seeing what's coming next. So the resolution of the season as season often flies with the owl at dusk, so to speak. That's natural and okay. Let's not get too frustrated with that. But the question would be, would it ever be possible to have the gift of recognizing that you are in a season while you're in the middle of it? That would be helpful, right? That would be, now to me, it's a bit like the experience of, I grew up in rural southern Ontario, and it was all, you were always terrified, your parents made you terrified of ever getting lost in the cornfields. You probably talk about that in rural parts of Texas too, because everything looks the same, right? If you wander out to the middle of the cornfield, it is very, very difficult, especially if you're like, well, I was going to say, if you're a little kid. If you're me now in the middle of a cornfield, I still can't see where I'm going. And so what happens is, that's kind of our experience. To be historical temporal creatures embedded in time, you don't ever get a spiritual drone that lets you fly above time. So instead, it's a bit like being in this cornfield, and you're doing this kind of echolocation, and if you were lost in the cornfield, you were supposed to get really, really still, and then you listen. There's the creek. I think I hear the burble of the creek, and I think I heard a car way on a road over there, and now you do sort of echolocation, and you start to figure out where you were, but it requires utter stillness and listening very, very carefully. That, unfortunately, is what the work of discernment is like. It's not somebody comes up and says, oh, I have your diagnosis. This is where you are. Discernment is always messy, challenging, and difficult, but I want to give us one word of encouragement. Discernment requires a posture of prayerful listening in the midst of things, since we never get to be above the fray. We don't get to look at our now from the standpoint, what I call in the book, of a view from no when. Some people think they have a view from no when. Nobody does. However, there is one way you can kind of cheat and almost step out of your now. If you want to transcend time, build friendships across generations. Turns out, it's not sci-fi. If you want to transcend time, build friendships across generations. Though you can't stand outside of your season, you can hear from those who've gone through those seasons. And in my experience, this is probably the greatest gift of multi-generational friendships. Friendship in this case is like time travel. And in my experience, so often the word that comes from these older friends sounds a lot like the gospel itself, because it's usually some version of, be not afraid. You might look at this sort of like, what you think looks like this kind of idyllic life of an older saint in your congregation, right? An older friend that you know. And you look and they seem so intentional and grounded and placid, and if you didn't love and admire them so much, you would hate them for it. And what happens is you imagine it was a straight path there. And when you look at such a life from the mire in which you might find yourself, where you are overwhelmed and failing and flailing, it's really easy to be given to despair and envy. But then in a conversation, you learn that they've lived through past seasons you didn't see. You realize this friend has found that life on the other side of a season, much like you're enduring. A conversation with such a friend might actually help crystallize, oh, that's when I am. This is when I am. This is what I'm going through. It's a season. This is my season. And that conversation doesn't end the difficult season, okay? That's important. It's not an escape route. But it immediately stirs hope because now you're getting a report from the other side, which lets you know that there is a life beyond what presses in now and blocks our ability to see a different future. So when a friend reports from a future that you couldn't imagine, now your imagination is infused with a graced new possibility. Do you know what we call that? Hope. That's hope. Eventually, recognizing the season you're in means recognizing that you're the elder. So this applies to some of us more than others, but when I say, I still imagine the conversations I'm having, I'm learning from people who are seasons ahead of me, but now I also realize part of my calling is to give encouragement. I'll give you an example. So our kids are like 30, 28, 26, 24, and they are our best friends, and we have amazing times together. And so people sometimes look at our lives and they're like, oh my gosh, I wish, I can't believe it. It's like, I have stories to tell you. Have you ever been to a police station? Have you ever been to, right? And all of a sudden people look at the snapshot. Show them the video. Show them the video of the history. And what you're sharing is, this was our story. This was our history. Don't think that the present is a predictor of the past. Okay, one last theme, maybe two. By the way, I do want to say, also don't ever fall into the trap of thinking that you are your season. Do you all know the Fleet Foxes? Fantastic song on Shore, I think. I Am Not My Season. Really, really great way to listen. That's a good spiritual adventure right there. Okay, last thing I'll say is this, and I want to close with this encouragement. If you understand this principle of seasonality in the Christian life, in the spiritual life, then I hope it would reduce your anxiety when you discover that you're relating differently to God. While God is eternal, creatures are seasonal. And so our relationship to God is characterized by a seasonality that I want us to appreciate is natural, expected, and good. In the same way that you relate differently to a parent when you are 18 versus 48, and by the way, if you're relating to your 48-year-old children the same way you did when they were 18 or 8, that's a problem. Arrested development. So we relate differently, right, to a parent at different stages in our life. So it is natural to relate differently to God at different points in the journey of creaturehood through time. Now, in some ways, this will be experienced perhaps as an ebb and a flow with varying waves of intimacy and distance and enthusiasm and struggle. But when you cultivate an expectation of this, the seasons of ebb and distance need not be alarming, even if they might be difficult and puzzling. The seasons of relating to God might also be varying dynamics of understanding God's presence. Look, you will, and surely probably many of you have experienced seasons of, let's say, intense emotional connection, a kind of exuberance of the Spirit shared in community in which joy is the dominant note. Thanks be to God. But then you might enter a season, perhaps surprising and puzzling, where God is experienced in and as stillness. A contemplative season in which God's covenant faithfulness is this kind of steady state of enduring. And it's less like the Taylor Swift love song, and it's more like the quiet chant of the monastery hour upon hour. If the person from the exuberant season right, in your life could see the you now in this contemplative stillness season, it might look like a kind of distance or coolness from the outside. Do you know what I mean? So if my young, sort of enthusiastic, exuberant, extroverted for Jesus self saw the kind of old man Jamie who actually finds an intense experience of God's presence sitting there doing nothing, this self might think, are you not a Christian anymore? But that's because they don't understand all the different ways to experience God's faithful presence, right? That there is, that exuberant me doesn't yet have the capacity to comprehend the unspeakable comfort that is found in that contemplation to come. So when I talk about seasonality in our experience of God, God's nearness looks and feels different depending on the season you're in. It is never a question of whether God is near. I would say the sort of privileged name of God in spiritual timekeeping is Emmanuel, God with us. And while the experience of God's steadfast, covenant faithfulness can change over seasons of a life, the question isn't whether God is near, it's how we experience God's nearness. And so, as Thomas Merton says in New Seeds of Contemplation, sometimes you also have to go through experiencing a distance to grasp the nearness anew. And if you haven't been in that season, that sounds suspicious. Just wait. Just wait. You'll also find, by the way, that Scripture sounds different across the course of a life. Why? I have many things to tell you, but you cannot bear them now. God has many things to tell us from the canon of Scripture that's been gifted to us, and we can't bear them all now. The way that Scripture keeps incubating profound illumination and revelation for us is part of the adventure of time. Literary critic, my friend Jonathan probably knows her too, Rita Felsky, has this book on literary, this is going somewhere, has this book on literary criticism where she talks about affective climate change. Affective climate change. What she means is this. There is an experience of the soul's listening such that you could hear the same song 15,000 times, and not until you heard it when you were 58 did you really hear it for the first time. And interestingly, this is for middle-aged white guy reference, there is a literal sociological study of people listening to Bruce Springsteen. And if you're like me, so in the 80s, Bruce Springsteen is kind of like, yeah, Born to Run, Born in the USA, Courtney Cox dance video, that's all cool. He's kind of like sort of mainstream and sort of, yeah, okay, whatever, give me U2. And then all of a sudden you hit 50 and you go back and you listen to Nebraska. And it's like this guy is reading your mail. And he has just plumbed the depths of your soul, and all of a sudden you understand something about yourself and your longings and your yearnings and your regrets and your disappointments, and the same song has been spinning on the turntable for 45 years. What's changed is not the song, it's me. It's my capacity to receive it. That's what the Spirit's incubation is doing in us as we are encountering Scripture across the course of the life. What is the Spirit incubating in you this season? What's gestating? How are you going to be born again? And so the final word of encouragement and maybe benediction. God will be just as faithful to you in the next season as this one. That's the game changer. God is always faithful. So you can let go. You can move forward. You can fear not. I know that to be on the verge of seasonal change is very anxiety-inducing, and I'm sure some of us are in the midst of it right now. But remember that though the seasons change, God's presence with never does. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jamie. That was
Sorry, a little long.
no, that was so. We have all the time in the world, no pun intended. You'll see microphones set up here on either end of the sanctuary. I'm sure this spurred thoughts in your head. It did mine. I have one question to start us off, but feel free to line up. We'll have a mic here as well. We'll just go back and forth either side of the sanctuary. First question is in relation to time and us being creatures and that not being a bad thing. In other words, in the new heavens and the new earth, sin will be eradicated, but our creatureliness won't.
Yes.
What can we infer about heaven and the seasonality and goal of heaven from the fact that in heaven we won't escape time, that we will be bound, and that apparently there is some goal even in the new heavens and the new earth? Maybe we'll explore planets. Maybe there's any number of answers to that question, but what can we infer about our eternal state from time?
Yeah, I love this because I do think it transforms our sense of what the hope is. And I think it's Gregory of Nyssa in the Song of Moses who emphasizes that what the sort of transformation that catches us up into the kingdom, into heaven, is not a conclusion. It is a sort of reconnoitering of the eternal itinerary of plumbing the depths and mystery and riches of God's utter, infinite mystery. And so in that sense, you need forever for temporal creatures to keep exploring that. But I also, I try not to get too speculative about heaven, but it does seem to me that precisely because we are those whose confession is we believe in the resurrection of the dead, the resurrection of the body, wherever you have bodies, you have location and you have time. And so I still think that is a beautiful picture that, and the reason why I think it's significant is I do think still functionally there are a lot of forms of Christianity that think salvation is to get sky-hooked out of time. And because they also subtly, maybe not explicitly, but kind of functionally think the goal is to get out of our bodies. And that's a very detrimental version of Christianity that we need to sort of excise, I think. Yeah.
St. Maximus begins talking about place rather than space as a reaction to the sort of Neoplatonist church fathers who said almost that we're trying to escape this place, have a beatific vision, and then kind of be done. Yeah. But how boring would that feel if we're told we're done?
Yes.
The end is
exactly.
at our death. Yeah.
That's why, I'm not even kidding. I kind of keep hoping I get to take my library to heaven. Because there's no way I will have finished all these books on my shelf, despite everything I told my wife when I bought the books. And it just seems to me that that's like, Isaiah tells us in Isaiah 60 that the ships of Tarshish will sail into the kingdom of God. And I'm like, can my library? Because I would love to keep exploring these things. Yeah.
Well done. Well, we'll go here to the right, starting with Larry, and then over to the left, going to Jeremy. I just remind you, if you would form your questions in the form of a question, and so we can
don't just raise your voice at the end of a comment.
Yeah, that's right.
Just kidding.
There's only one Canadian in here.
What?
Larry.
What?
Yeah.
So, as a man who's flown through many desks and is still doing that, thankfully, an observation and then a question is, it seems like faith communities are so uncomfortable with mess. And it's not okay to not be okay. And so as we journey through life and experience deep disappointments and the tragedies and those seasons that you reflected on, what words would you have for a community that, in my view, needs to embrace mess and not only allow it, but seek it out, expose it, and love through it?
No, I think it's it's exactly why patience is the relevant virtue here too, right? Like, how do I learn to wait because I don't know it all and we won't figure it out? I think that part of what I want to say is we are the community. The church is supposed to be, called to be that community who every single week when we gather around word and table engage in the act of confession. So it's really puzzling to me that we sort of don't have room to be honest. Like, are we faking it when we say confession? Although, except I think there are so many gatherings of Christians that don't engage in confession. So then you tell yourself a different story about, well, we're here because we kind of deserve it. So I think just realizing that the story of our messiness is kind of built into the narrative of Christian worship itself, and therefore it is something that God recognizes and kind of builds scaffolding for us to live into rather than pretending we can escape it. Maybe a good way to say it.
I'm just curious, is it possible to kind of experience multiple seasons simultaneously, both individually but also communally? I'm like, as I'm thinking of examining when I am,
Yep.
it's like this really messy Venn diagram.
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely, right? And I think you can imagine part of discernment is figuring out, okay, I can't do everything right now, so what do I think we are called to like focus on or prior? But you're always sort of inhabiting multiple time zones, as it were, in that regard, collectively and communally. And so it's never as neat and tight, back to mess, it's never as neat and tidy that. I think the discernment process is figuring out, okay, what is asked of me now? I will always have multiple obligations. Which one sort of gets the lead? Which one has the sort of overriding focus without abdicating my other responsibilities? Yeah, very important.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. That was great.
Great.
All right. So here's my question. You alluded to this idea of you are not your season, which to me alludes to this idea of someone who is sort of eating the comfort food, so to speak, of fatalism or self-deprecation. And that has its obvious dangers in sort of being more vulnerable to the lies of the tempter. But do you think there is another version of that, which is overly content with the season without the fatalism, and is that dangerous?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. I will say I feel like I have seen that less in terms of the risk and danger of it, but I think I can imagine that that's a possibility. I think when I say you are not your season, I'm trying to address the fact that seasons often befall us. There's a certain involuntariness about, their climate, they're environmental. And so I think it can be really debilitating for some people to think, oh, I'm going through this, and then they start, or the enemy starts telling them, I must deserve it, or what did I do wrong to get here, or something, and it induces shame. This is something I talk a lot about in the book, is why shame is so fundamentally anti-gospel. And I want people to realize, no, wait a sec. Seasons befall us, and they come at us, and we go through them, and it's not a judgment of your character or the purity of your faith or something like that. I think the notion of contentment probably goes along with people not recognizing seasons, right? And they're not actually discerning what they're called to in that moment. Maybe that's it. Yeah, great question.
Real briefly, what's the value of not discerning a season, but a self-imposed season such that the church calendar would bring about?
Oh, yeah. So this is, I think that one of the great gifts of the liturgical calendar is, first of all, it means you kind of set your story clock to God's time, right? So you're constantly recalibrating your watch to God's time, as it were. But I also think it is because, as you know, the liturgical calendar is basically just an annual invitation to inhabit the life of Jesus. it affords possibilities for discernment precisely because you keep doing it over and over again. In You Are What You Love, I say there's no formation without repetition. And I also think repetition creates possibilities for incubation, as we were talking about it, and for you to now hear something new. Yeah, it's a great question.
God seems to have taught me something about not short-circuiting hard seasons in my life, but I recognize others going through hard seasons, especially those I have a particular impact on, my kids, my wife, employees, or my older parents. How can you help nudge others to not short-circuit their hard seasons without coming off as just heartless or que sera, sera?
Yeah, no, I would say, and I'm sure you know this, but I actually think presence with and inviting a kind of reflection and contemplation to understand why enduring is its own spiritual act of courage is powerful. And so I don't think you have to explain it. I think it's not so much explaining it as coming alongside and inviting the illumination and insight to sort of bubble up. By the way, on that same point too, when I say we shouldn't, rush a season or short circuit it, I think everybody knows what I mean there. It's not the same as saying, because I always have ringing in my ear Dr. King's concern about the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, which I do think is a narcotic that has drugged a lot of us. And so there's also a kind of, I don't know if you guys talked about this in your conversations, Guy, but there is also a certain kind of sanctified impatience that characterizes the Christian life. And I'm trying to invite us over the course of the book to inhabit both of those things. Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned that seasons are different in different areas of life.
Yes.
Can you all hear me okay? I hate a microphone, sorry.
Yeah. Don't be shy to stand up.
Okay. So I had a question on that. You titled the discernment of recognizing that you're in a season before the end of that season as a gift.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you delve into that? You addressed this a little bit earlier, but
Right.
can you delve into that for those of us who feel as if the recognition of a season within the season, before you've gotten to the end of it, feels like a failure?
No, so it would be like a bonus. Maybe I'll put it that way. Because it is common and natural and still a gift to get through a season and at the end of it then finally recognize, oh, that's what God was doing. That's when I've been. This is what I'm carrying from it. That's still a gift. What I think the extra gift, but now, if you buy, the extra gift, if you can get discernment of a season in the midst of it, it does, I think, engender a kind of patience that's harder to pull off in the middle of it, because now you're sort of like, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. I don't like it. By the way, not all seasons are terrible. But imagine it's a difficult season, right? Like it's a difficult, and so you're like, okay, I've been hating this, but now I see, all right, somebody else has gone through this. What is God asking of me now? And what is happening in me? And what do I have to sort of wait for? I think that sort of motivates patience. That would be the added gift. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thanks. That's a good clarifying question.
Hey, Dr. Smith, thanks for
Hi.
being here tonight. I know we've all benefited from it, so really appreciate
Thank
it.
you so much.
So my question is, and I know that most of the conversation so far has been a lot about kind of personal
Yes.
sort of things, but I know you
Yes.
said you'd welcome questions about more social
Yes.
implications
Yes.
of some of this. And so primarily I'm interested to kind of understand some of your thoughts around how time interacts with place. And
Okay.
a lot of kind of what I mean by that is obviously we're all born into communities, we're all born into cultures, we're all born into countries and et cetera,
Yes.
or ecclesial traditions, what have you.
Yep.
I'm interested to get some of your thoughts on not only just wisdom that we can gain intergenerationally for how we interact with some of the seasons in our own personal life, but also how we think about our inheritance culturally.
Yes.
And
So
what that
this is great. And by the way, this is like a huge part of the book that I So I suggest that I talk about spiritual timekeeping as kind of having 3 beats: reckoning, discernment, and hope, right? So reckoning is grappling with our past. And that's where I think, and this is where communities and collectives need to do this, because the histories that got us who we are is always the fruit of when we've been and what we've undergone and how we've been shaped. And by the way, there's just a ton of contingency and twists and turns and zigs and zags that get us to a place. But if we are going to know who we are and what we're called to, collectively and communally, we do have to reckon with the history that has got us here, what has been handed down. Now, reckoning, I do think a big part of reckoning is confronting the parts of our histories we've buried, we wanted to forget. It's why I think nostalgia is such a dangerous drug. Nostalgia is a remembrance of the past that selects and edits it to serve an interest for now. Whereas reckoning is a prophetic confrontation with the fullness of the history that we don't want to face. But the point of that is not shame. The point is to then grapple with what habits we need to unlearn, right? So the reckoning. However, there's also a positive aspect of reckoning, which is to see, oh, these are the possibilities that have been handed down to me, right? That I have a future that is possible because we have experienced this history. And so does that make sense? So it's both sides of that. And it's always given a very specific particular history that you then discern, what is the church called to now? What is our city called to now? What is our country called to now? And I think we are doing that work. Do you know, like, I'll be honest, as I was writing the book, the murder of George Floyd was a huge catalyst for a national reckoning in this country. And a lot of people want to short-circuit it and do it faster or get to the reconciliation and hugs way too quickly. But it's also connected to place. Like, look, when you drive through downtown Dallas, read the stones. And what I mean is, look where the freeways are. Those freeways weren't always there. They were not there 100 years ago. What was? Oh, you'll learn. Do the homework. What was there? Who was displaced? Who has benefited? Where do we fit in that story? I think that is a spiritual exercise, right? That is a reckoning. But it's all for the sake of living into a different future that God is calling us to in the kingdom. Yeah. Sorry, it's just such a big. David, am I doing anything wrong? That's 2.
Hey, if we could get a handheld mic, and as that's coming up, it seems to me the discernment piece is not only what period we're in, but you quote Cal Serveld in the book, and I remember Cal once said, you know, the discernment to know, we're supposed to conserve that order of Genesis 1 and 2. We're supposed to keep a static human nature and so forth. And yet, in the cultural mandate, we have implicit the progress towards the last chapters of Revelation. We have, and so the discernment is, what is the creatureliness of humanity that we are to keep and preserve? And then when, as you say, are we to be impatient and throwing off the order of Genesis 3? And it's not always immediately. You know, sometimes I'll be counseling someone and they'll be repenting of a mistake. They'll be repenting of their creatureliness. Well, we ought not do that.
Exactly.
Right? Jesus made mistakes, not sins, but
Yeah.
mistakes. He grew in stature and wisdom. And so
Yes.
the discernment
Yeah.
of recognizing where to keep Genesis 1, where to throw off Genesis 3 isn't always easy. Hopefully that wasn't a vamping. Right over here.
It's great.
No, I appreciate your talk about patience, and you said that some things take time. And even within that time, there's silence within that. And so my question kind of is based on that. It says, if sometimes patience is explored through the process of silence, could the silence from the Father in Gethsemane be a form of his patience with Jesus' humanity?
Wow. I'm not going to touch that because I just don't know. I'm nervous. There's like priests in the room, and whenever I'm a philosopher and I step into the Bible and I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I think that's a really, really interesting suggestion. I would say it seems to me that you are seeing Trinitarian patience all over that whole episode, right? Because I think Jesus is also maybe embodying that paradoxical combination of a kind of impatience that also is receiving, right? And is enduring. And that's very suggestive. Yeah, you're ahead of me. You've left me with something to think about. Thank you. It's great.
Well, first I wanted to say, do you know today's Michaelmas, which is
No.
traditionally the change of the seasons when the farmers would shoot. So fittingly, this talk is given, I thought you planned the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Not Anglican.
Or Catholic.
Yeah.
So I had a question. We touched on the church calendar a little bit, and sometimes in service I'll tell people, the church calendar gives us the ability to feel things in different seasons.
Yes.
So
Yes.
even if you're newly married, keep a Holy Lent. Even
Yes.
if you're sad, celebrate Easter. How does art maybe in different seasons give us the ability, how could we maybe use art as a counterpoint sometimes to the season we're in? Not just, I connect with Bruce Springsteen right now.
Right.
But, actually now this piece of art, I'm really happy and I'm in a good season, but maybe
Yeah.
this piece of art can drive me deeper.
Well, tell me, stay there for a second.
Yeah.
The art example is interesting because actually I think you had to have listened to it 15,000 times for it to yield that possibility.
Yeah.
So there is something about, creating the aesthetic wallpaper of your life, which you think isn't doing anything, but actually is sort of incubating possibilities that will be activated later. It's a little bit like, remember in the dark what you learned in the light kind of principle. And I do think one of the reasons why, I'm editor-in-chief of Image, a literary quarterly, and one of the reasons I'm committed to that and why I love the sort of ongoingness of a literary quarterly subscription is art just keeps coming at you and into your house. And I journey with it because I don't know what wells it is digging that I will be drinking from later. Yeah. And only if you make art a lifestyle, right? Only if it's kind of like woven into the fabric of your life are you creating the possibilities for God to then activate it in either a season of joy or sadness or whatever it might be. And I would love, by the way, for the church to be a patron who keeps confronting people with the arts in that same spirit. Yeah, it's great.
Just to keep a reminder of time, we will end right at 8:30. Dr. Smith has graciously agreed to assign books outside, so if you didn't get your question answered, there will be more opportunities afterwards.
Yeah, so I had a question back to kind of what is the cultural or communal implications of timekeeping.
Yeah.
And you kind of already answered it, but I guess I would refrain or expand the question of the impact of how a community decides, whether that's the church,
Yeah.
a neighborhood, a family,
Right.
a nation, what season we're in,
Right.
and what's the power dynamics that play in there, and like the influence of that.
I mean,
the danger
I
of
do
it.
think,
Good.
I think all discernment, by the way, even for myself, has to be communal, right? Like I need the gift of others in my life to help me to discern. I think, let's take, for example, a congregation, let's say, they're trying to discern. I think it's interesting, if you look at Acts 10 or 15, there's like arguing, fighting, there's like disagreement. Like it's not fun. It's not fun to be discerning. And yet you are sort of responding to a call and you have to kind of you have to have enough covenant commitment to one another that you're willing to go through the hard work of that discernment. I think sometimes the hard work of discernment is a stress test for congregations that many fail. And it mostly is just unveiling weaknesses that hadn't been built up in their capacity to be able to do that hard work. I don't really have a formula or anything like that, except that I think it is, discernment is also always contextual. right? It's always responding to a situation. I'm sure pastors are, for example, discerning what congregational life looks like post-pandemic. Like, what do we do now, right? What has happened? Where are we? When are we? What are we doing? And I also don't think there's only one right answer to a discernment process. I think it's mostly what discernment is about is intentionality. It's not like, oh, there's a secret answer hidden inside a babushka doll, and we have to get through it. If we can get to the one little secret message, we'll figure it out. I think it's more about joining the Spirit intentionally and listening to say, what are we sensing our call right now? Which will, if you want the formula and the kind of spreadsheet, will sound very frustrating to you. I don't know. I don't think we get anything better than that, in a sense. Yeah.
Hey, do you have any thoughts on a healthy way to approach a season when you have absolutely no idea how long that season will last?
Well, it's a great question. You'd think I'd have an answer. Two things. And again, this sounds so banal and simplistic, but the worst thing to be in any season is alone. And so I'm just convinced that sometimes our seasons are challenging in a way that we almost want to isolate ourselves, and I would just caution and say that's the worst. It's always, isolating yourself is always the worst thing you can do. So there's that communal dynamic that I think is absolutely crucial, where you remain near to friends who are like little sacraments of God's faithful presence to you. The other thing is, I do think is you can cultivate a prayerful capacity of availability. I don't mean understanding it, getting it, solving it, figuring it out. I just mean a kind of disciplined availability where you almost try to approach this with a spiritual curiosity, and the first word to God is, I wonder what you're doing. I wonder what you're doing. It's okay to also end that with, how long, O Lord? Honestly, but to sort of come with that capacity for a spiritual wonder and knowing that it's God with you in the midst of that. Yeah. It's great. It's an important question.
Last two questions, here and here.
Hi, thank you. My request would be, would you speak to how you process just briefly, the backdrop of death to this whole discussion of seasonality and temporality?
Yeah. So, ending on a high note. So, I do say in the book, and I don't know how y'all will feel about this, but I think in some ways spiritual timekeeping is about receiving the gift of our mortality. Now, for me, mortality is not just about you will die, although it's part of it. I think it is actually receiving the gift of the fact that I age. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not, and I don't want to get into the theological debates about this, but there are at least legitimate Christian conversations about whether a kind of death could have been experienced apart from the fall. We're not going to get into it. I'm not going to fight about it. But all I mean to say is I think there is something about mortality, and obviously there's a huge difference between the tragic loss of a death that cuts something short and a farewell to Her Majesty Elizabeth II, right? Does that seem like a fair, not that that's not a loss, but not all loss is tragic. And so I think learning to love what you'll lose is part of the discipline of a spiritual timekeeping. And to realize that losing things is, again, not all tragic. It's not all fall. It's not all curse. In a way, you could say I've lost my kids' toddler years. They're never coming back. They will never come back. And by the way, I blew it. I'm being honest. I blew it. So, what do? How do I learn to love what I lost? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be awesome, Grandpa. But there's all kinds of sort of loss that is just, I think, bound up with creaturehood, not with fallenness. And to learn, I think it's cultivating a posture where you have hands outstretched and you receive gifts gladly, but you're not clinging, right? You're not, you don't love something. Augustine says in the Confessions, when he's just bereft at the loss of a friend in Book 4 of the Confessions, I loved one who was mortal as if he would never die. I think that's what we need. We need to hold with open hands that gift. Yeah, sorry, too long of an answer.
A tick in the death column there would be Jesus, the first fruits of a new creation. What does he do after he is that first fruit of the new creation? But kill a fish and eat it, which implies something, at least, that maybe we can have fish sticks. And the new heavens and new earth. A win in my column. Dr. Robin Turner, last question.
So I work in children's spirituality, and I'm interested in your
God
thoughts.
bless you.
Thank you. I love it. I wonder if you have thoughts on the early seasons, and there's something about the wisdom that comes at dusk, and there's also maybe the work of the Spirit and the dove at dawn.
Absolutely, yeah, and if you think of when I was talking about multi-generational friendships, the part I talked about was mostly the gifts coming from the future of those who are ahead of us. Absolutely, the gift of multi-generational friendships is also receiving the gifts of those who are younger, who actually kind of often have their pulse on a now that is unavailable to old men like me. It's one of the reasons I love being a college professor, is you just kind of keep in touch with 18-year-olds, which is slightly terrifying, but also it's like, oh, the world has kind of moved on without me. Do you know what I mean? You don't get Seinfeld jokes anymore? What's going on? So there's something, and I think the beauty of that Jesus holds up childlike faith as a kind of capacity. There is a capacity there that probably petrifies in us. And we do well to remain in that relationship to keep trying to soften the hearts and availability. Yeah, it's great.
Just as Guy comes forward, please join me in expressing appreciation.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, again, thank you so much for being here tonight. As you are moving out, there's a little bit of instruction. Dr. Smith is going to be in the foyer, the North X, with books. If you want to purchase a book, it's limited supply, so I would encourage you to get a book as soon as you can. No fighting. And he will be there to sign. Quick conversation, because I'm sure several people want signatures. I should also say this. There are 3 distinct partners that have helped make tonight happen. One, Logos Bookstore, which is, you can thank them on the way out. Tremendous partners in the event tonight. I will also say, all the way from St. Paul, Minnesota, is the other art house that is operational, Art House North, with Sarah and Troy Groves. Great friends. They had made the live stream possible tonight. So for everyone who's tuned in live stream, I heard there was a little bit of technical difficulty. I think everybody's on board now with the stream. And has got most of the program. But huge thanks to Art House North and their community, and of course All Saints Church here in Dallas. So round of applause for the 3 partners. And so go out, enjoy conversation, enjoy another drink if you'd like, enjoy those conversations with Dr. Smith if you'd like, and find out more about Art House on our website. Thanks so much for coming out.